After my Dragon Roost analysis, I got a request to look at a later game dungeon in Wind Waker. So today we're going to be diving into the Earth Temple to analyze the progression in early game dungeon design to late game dungeon design. If you haven't checked out the Dragon Roost video already, be sure to click here for context for today. First, let's dive into some thematic and narrative choices. At first glance, the Earth Temple seems a bit out of place. You enter a cave on a very small island in the Great Sea and jump down a hole that spits you out into an expansive crypt. How did this underwater dungeon full of redeads, Stalfos, and Poes come to be? Well, the Earth Temple used to be above ground and was used by the Earth Sages to pray for the power to repel evil to remain in the Master Sword. When Ganon returned to Hyrule and the Hero of Time was nowhere to be seen, he executed the sages in the Earth Temple and sent legions of undead to guard the temple. Laruto, the last sage of the Earth Temple, appears as a ghost in the game to tell her descendant Medli of her duty to return to the Earth Temple and re-imbue the Master Sword with its original power. Compared to Dragon Roost, the stakes have increased significantly here. Whereas before you were aiding the Rito to restore their home, now you are fighting to avenge a fallen sage to gain the power to bring down the ultimate evil, Ganon himself. The full scope of your quest has been revealed, and restoring the Earth and Wind Temples will allow you to confront Ganon's tower and finish the game. This is a common device in games. There always needs to be a progression in the scope of conflict you face, both so the player feels like they are becoming more powerful, and so the mystery is maintained in the early game to keep the player guessing as to where their adventures will next lead them. The environment of the temple continues a stark contrast in theming with earlier dungeons like Dragon Roost. The first two dungeons in Wind Waker are natural environments. They may be hostile, but I wouldn't describe them as places overrun with evil or maleficence. The Tower of Gods is a trial that hasn't itself been corrupted, and the Forsaken Fortress still seems like a normal pirate's hideout. The state of the Earth Temple, however, is a constant reminder of Ganon's menace. This first sinks in for me in this room of the temple, where a giant Redead statue looms over you with a creepy smile, surrounded by cursed fog below. The statue's resemblance to a Redead almost seems to be a warning that a fate worse than death awaits you in this place. As you further progress, all variety of horror confronts you, whether it be a Stalfos dragging their club behind them to smash you, or floor masters stalking the room, waiting to suck you into the void. One interesting element of the theme in the Earth Temple is the tribal influence throughout the dungeon. Whether it be the elaborate markings on the statues, the earrings on the Redeads, the long hair of the Stalfos, the elephant-like statues here, or the scorpion-shaped mirrors there, everything seems to give off the vibe of an ancient civilization inspired by the Aztec and Mayan traditions. The music further cements this impression. Drums play in the background, and the didgeridoo, a beloved Australian Aboriginal instrument, plays in the foreground. The song itself is minimalist, but highly effective at conveying the unnerving environment of the dungeon. The tribal influences here are made unsettling, because whatever culture existed there is now nothing but a mere shell for the evil that now possesses it. Dragon Roost may have been threatened by Ganon's presence, but here in the Earth Temple, it has completely taken over. The second subject we'll focus on is mechanical progression. Dragon Roost is a very player-friendly first dungeon. So can the Earth Temple ramp up the complexity while still remaining approachable? We can get a couple obvious comparisons out of the way. The Earth Temple is a much lengthier dungeon than Dragon Roost. Dragon Roost is split into about 20 rooms, but they're mostly small chambers containing single-step puzzles. The Earth Temple contains a similar number of rooms, but each room usually contains puzzles or fights that are longer and more difficult than anything in Dragon Roost. Now let's dive into 3 specific ways this mechanical complexity arises in the dungeon. First, the player's core notions about the game are challenged. The primary example of this is when Link is attacking enemies. When Link is fighting these new purple chews, they prove impervious to the sword. Instead, Link will have to use light to solidify the chews and destroy them. Same with the Poes, except they'll have to be exposed to direct light for longer. This also sort of applies to the Stalfos, as hitting the body with the sword won't actually damage it, instead the head has to be targeted. The Stalfos can be brought down with the sword, but using bombs or other items is a much more efficient way to take it down. These scenarios are well set up for teaching moments, because it can be pretty much expected the player will approach something like a purple chew and try to attack it with the sword. The way that the chew then reacts to the sword can be used as a hint towards the real solution. In this case, the chew being impervious to physical attacks, showing that something besides a weapon needs to be used. These new behaviors can then be iterated like any other mechanic. The chew is relatively non-threatening, so it is a good enemy to introduce the concept of light doing damage to it. Later on, when you fight more aggressive enemies like Pose and have to use light again, the player doesn't have to figure this out while also dodging a flaming lantern and getting possessed. It's a good reminder that you can expect the player to complete harder tasks in late game dungeons, but careful attention still must be paid towards teaching the player. These examples extend into a second point, that the sources of danger to the player are reworked. Wind Waker is considered to be one of the easiest Zelda games, but the Earth Temple consistently feels threatening to the player. It does this by challenging the player in ways besides lowering their current heart total. Cursed Fog strips the player of any ability to use their items, forcing them to retreat from whatever situation they're in without fighting. Pose possess the player, causing their controls to be reversed. Redead shriek at the player, rendering them completely unable to do anything while they creep up towards you. Finally, Floor Masters try to grab Link and Medley and will pull them back to a room towards the start of the dungeon if successful. Sometimes these concepts are even used in conjunction, like this room with Fog and Floor Master, where I'm forced to run from these menaces without even getting to attack them. I am much more scared of Floor Masters than any other enemy in Zelda. No matter how many hearts I have, if I make one wrong move against these guys, I'm faced with retracing my steps throughout the whole dungeon. My fear hits at the core reasons why these mechanics are effective at adding suspense and threatening the player. They make you feel powerless. They strip you of the things you normally rely on, and when you try to use an item and it doesn't work, or you think you're fine because you're at full health and then aren't, it's like pulling a rug out from under you, and suddenly you start panicking. This psychological trick is especially effective because once we no longer trust what we once relied on, we're more on edge and less likely to trust anything in the future. Every subsequent encounter is filled with uncertainty, and that uncertainty translates to fear. I was curious if other people thought the temple was as effective at being creepy as I did, so I turned to the YouTube comments section for the dungeon theme, and my thoughts were confirmed. Although the temple is very creepy, the game is kind enough to give you two defenses against the dark. First, by manipulating light, you can overcome most of the hazards, as well as light up the dungeon. When you get the mirror shield, you gain the agency to fight back against the monsters. Secondly, Medley is with you for the entire dungeon and prevents you from ever feeling too alone. This is doubly effective, as the atmosphere also incentivizes the player to protect Medley, and solidifies a bond for the player, making them genuinely care about Medley. She was always a fan favorite, and the Earth Temple no doubt played a big part in solidifying the fan adoration. The next big thing the Earth Temple does to ramp up mechanical complexity is to introduce longer, more in-depth puzzles. These puzzles are able to be more complex largely because of the nature of the item you get, as well as your teamwork with Medley. Pretty much every puzzle in the Earth Temple revolves around manipulating light. You can do this from the start using Medley's harp, and eventually you're also able to reflect light with the mirror shield. This is pretty unique in dungeon design, because the item doesn't let you do anything especially novel, it just expands the possibilities of something you were already doing. Think of the City of the Sky in Twilight Princess. You already have the claw shot, but you get the double claw shot, which expands the potential of what you could do with the item. This works because the concept of reflecting light is a somewhat scalable property, so to speak. If light can bounce off one surface, then it can bounce off 2, 3, or even 10 other surfaces as well. Medley and Link can now work together to bounce light off each other in difficult angles anywhere in the room. Contrast this with Dragon Roost, where you can only use the grappling hook to cross any one ledge at a given time. The grappling hook works in Dragon Roost and fits with the dungeon, but it would have been hard to increase the complexity of the puzzles using the item. Meanwhile, in the Earth Temple, the final puzzle is probably the most elaborate in the entire game, and it requires you to move various statues around the room so that light can bounce off all of them in the perfect way. It's important to note, however, that this increased complexity comes with a cost. For most of the puzzles I described, you'll really just be spending a lot of time doing this. And every time you want to reposition Medley, you have to go through the trouble of playing the command melody, one false move or hey command later, and you have to play the entire song again to correct your mistake. It seems small, but in a dungeon where you'll likely have to play the song 25 or more times, it really adds up. I've already started talking about it, but the final area of mechanical complexity in the Earth Temple comes from having to worry about 2 people instead of 1. For each obstacle you face, your list of concerns effectively doubles. Normally, you're only worried about how you can solve a puzzle and survive the room. Now, your concerns also include how can you use Medley to help solve the puzzles, and how can you make sure she doesn't get captured or hurt as well. You can choose to explore parts of the dungeon without Medley, but if you go on by yourself for long enough, you'll eventually reach an impassable obstacle. Overall, the teamwork required when working with Medley is great, but at times it can feel like having to control both players in LEGO Star Wars. You'll spend a lot of time switching between the characters, and Medley is really bad at following you, so you'll probably just have to carry her everywhere. Maybe if this switching process was faster and Medley's AI wasn't so helpless, the issues would disappear, but it definitely feels clunky as is. One other side complaint, I would have liked to see the dungeon step up complexity in other ways. Dragon Roost is a very linear experience, and unfortunately, so is the Earth Temple. It might take longer, but the dungeon pretty much takes you on a constant path throughout the whole experience. There are choices to be made and a couple secrets to be found, but the sense of exploration really could have been enhanced with just a few more branching pathways. And there we have it. The Earth Temple clearly does a lot to step up the challenge from Dragon Roost. That being said, there's no hard and fast rule for difficulty in games. Many players will find your game too easy, while many players will find it too hard. What's important though is to practice the balance between application and learning. If a dungeon is just all about guidance, it'll feel like an extended tutorial. If it doesn't teach the player well enough, the player will end up feeling lost. If a player isn't forced to learn new things, they might grow bored with the repetitive gameplay. If there isn't enough application of the concepts though, then the game might feel shallow or unexciting. Overall, the Earth Temple and Dragon Roost keep this balance in mind, and that is why both dungeons end up being successful. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, and comment down below what you thought. Be sure to stay tuned for more game design and game dev content soon.